On November 16th, a flurry of articles began splashing across various newspapers, dramatically heralding President Kennedy's impending visit to Dallas. These pieces tantalizingly detailed a planned motorcade through the city's pulsating heart, a route fraught with unspeakable destiny. Unbeknownst to the ordinary citizens, eagerly anticipating a glimpse of their charismatic leader, these articles were effectively sealing Kennedy's tragic fate. It was not just the average Dallas residents who were stirred by this news. A more sinister cohort was also lying in wait. Among the throngs of everyday people, figures like Lee Harvey Oswald and members of the Campisi family were particularly attentive. Whispered stories and rampant rumors had already been circulating in certain Dallas circles, fueled by speculations of Kennedy's visit, a strategic move to drum up financial support for his upcoming re-election campaign and to solidify backing for Vice President Johnson. The November 16th article did more than mark Kennedy's itinerary. It etched his doom into the annals of history. Knowledgeable of the city's layout, certain ominous figures understood. There were merely two possible routes for the president's journey. One perilous path would lead him directly past the Texas School Book Depository, the stage for an impending national tragedy. This cascade of events was triggered not merely by Kennedy's political stances on organized crime and corruption, nor solely by his vigorous dance with power. Rather, it was ignited by his audacious actions just weeks prior, when he unveiled the hidden depths of American warfare against organized crime. Kennedy had shaken the very foundations of the nation by exposing a clandestine empire that even the formidable FBI under J. Edgar Hoover vehemently denied: the existence of the Cosa Nostra on American soil. In 1962, Joseph Valachi broke a long-standing code of silence among America's clandestine underworld, setting off a chain reaction of revelations that had not been seen before. His testimony was a watershed moment during the Kennedy administration, distinguishing him as a crucial informant who dared to do what others shunned, going on record to publicly expose the Mafia's members, its staggering power, and its deep-seated connections. This was not merely an assault on organized crime. It was a strategic demolition of the Mafia's ability to operate within elite circles, irreversibly tarnishing their reputations. These revelations came hot on the heels of the fall of Lucky Luciano, whose secrets Valachi carried forward. Within a year, propelled by figures like Vito Genovese and other New York mobsters, these ancient secrets, older than the mobsters themselves, spilled out into the public sphere. The exposure did not just highlight the notorious operations in New York or the Chicago outfit, but also cast a spotlight on one of America's oldest criminal enterprises, the Louisiana criminal syndicate. At this juncture, this crime family was intricately linked with the Central Intelligence Agency, had corrupted swathes of the FBI, and maintained a facade of legitimacy that concealed their true nature. In a dramatic spectacle in October 1963, in front of a riveted national audience, Valachi named Carlos Marcello as one of the most formidable mob bosses in American history. As the ominous articles began circulating in Dallas on November 16th about Kennedy's visit, other publications hinted at threats to Kennedy's life. Threats not from the CIA or J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, but from Cuban exiles, the far right, and organized crime, all reputedly under Marcello's control. Carlos Marcello, a kingpin entwined with Senator Johnson through financial support, had chosen Dallas deliberately. A city was Kennedy, despite his previous uneventful motorcade rides through other cities, would be fatally vulnerable. States like Illinois and Florida, under the thumb of powerful mobsters, had previously ensured Kennedy's safety. But Dallas was a different playing field, controlled by the likes of the Campisi and Marcello families. The ferocious reaction from these crime families was fueled by the fear of losing their future and their standing in America. It was not just Luciano who dealt with deportation. Now Marcello, Russell Bufalino, Vito Genovese, and others confronted similar existential threats. The looming spectre of prison and deportation galvanized them into desperate action. Amidst this turbulent backdrop, the articles that began appearing were not mere journalistic endeavors. They were the first public acknowledgement of the deep-seated secrets of organized crime, secrets that Valachi had begun to reveal. These revelations laid bare the structured hierarchy of the mafia, from madmen to capo regimes, which had remained shrouded in mystery until Valachi's courageous disclosures. His testimony marked a revolutionary moment in the fight against organized crime, changing the landscape forever. On my channel, I have delved into the shadowy realms where figures loomed large over the American landscape like a clandestine banking cartel. They were the invisible governors of the nation, operating a covert government that orchestrated the strings of power through the 60s. I aim to unravel the complex tapestry of the New York Mafia's storied past compared to the Chicago Mafia's turbulent history. Both crime syndicates, notorious and steeped in notoriety, faced public scrutiny and severe setbacks, yet navigated these challenges with cunning resilience. However, Florida presented a unique scenario where mobsters could escape to Cuba and beyond, dodging the legal furnace that threatened their empires. In stark contrast, one criminal syndicate stood seemingly invulnerable to Washington's reach, corrupting the societal fabric and rigging elections for over half a century: the Louisiana Mafia, led by the formidable duo of Carlos Marcello and members of the Silver Dollar Sam faction. Since the 30s, these men perfected a southern corruption machine that operated unchecked and thrived under every political radar. When President Kennedy stepped into this viper's nest, he was confronting not just a crime syndicate, but a global spider's web of illicit operations, perhaps without fully realizing the extent of the peril. This organization had withstood threats even during the tenure of Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose administration had managed to incarcerate notorious figures like Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. Yet the South, with its unique political corruption spearheaded by the likes of the Huey Long dynasty, remained a bastion of untouchable criminal influence. Carlos Marcello, towering as one of history's most formidable mobsters, had Louisiana's public officials vehemently denying his mafia affiliations. However, when Joseph Valachi broke the omerta to name Marcello as one of America's most powerful mob bosses, it marked a seismic shift in the battle against organized crime. Kennedy could now demonstrate to the American populace that although his efforts in Cuba might have faltered, he had scored a significant victory on the home front, a triumph that his predecessors had never achieved. This revelation brought everyone into a corner, from the corridors of Washington to the highest echelons of power, igniting a desperate desire to bury this problem. Yet Robert Kennedy's relentless pursuit of justice, this unwavering crusade against the mob, ultimately set the stage for a tragic denouement that would claim his life and that of his brother, JFK. In this narrative, the reverberations of Kennedy's relentless war on organized crime echo with devastating clarity. As we delve into the implications of his crusade, one cannot help but ponder the potential aftermath had Kennedy lived to continue his vigorous campaign. The landscape of organized crime was shaken to its core during his administration, hinting at a future where many of the era's most formidable mob bosses could have faced their downfall. Most of these crime lords, notorious figures who controlled the underworld with iron fists, surprisingly died as free men, their legacy of corruption left largely unchallenged. However, had Kennedy's anti-mafia initiatives not been abruptly halted, the trajectory of these mobsters would likely have veered dramatically towards incarceration. By the 70s, it is conceivable that many, if not all, would have been serving life sentences, their reigns of terror curtailed by the force of justice. Kennedy's assassination not only silenced a president, but also derailed a historic assault on organized crime. The potential for a significant cleanup of the mob's influence over American society was immense. Kennedy's strategic efforts pointed towards a future where the mafia's grip on the nation could have been definitively loosened, altering the course of U.S. history forever. This loss of momentum in the fight against organized crime remains one of the most significant what-ifs of his truncated presidency. Here is the article that came out in August 1963. The Valachi case represents the biggest intelligence breakthrough yet in combating organized crime and racketeering in the United States. It is the result of exceptional teamwork among the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section of the Justice Department. Without such coordination, the information from Valachi would have been largely wasted. The stakes involved are enormous. Many Americans think that organized crime does not involve them, and so tend to be only vaguely concerned. The fact is that the economic and political power of organized crime has grown so rapidly that while the lives of most Americans may not be directly affected, they are definitely and harmfully affected in indirect ways. We can all be affected by the negligence of a public official or a police officer who has been corrupted, by a gambler's fix of a sporting event, or by needlessly increased prices resulting from racketeers' involvement in business and labor. Today, the power of organized crime is being considerably blunted by the work of dedicated men and women in federal, state, and local enforcement agencies. But the battle cannot be won overnight, nor can it ever be fully won without the active help of an aroused citizenry. All Americans can participate in defending our basic freedoms by taking an active and informed interest in local as well as state and national politics, and by helping our law enforcement officers wherever and however they can. All Americans can help by remembering that if they place a bet with a bookie on a horse race or a football game, a heavy percentage of their money will end up in the greedy hands of a Valachi, a Genovese, or one of their henchmen. No one can afford to remain aloof from this effort. Magazines, newspapers, TV, and radio have a stern responsibility in putting the news of racketeering constantly before the public in its true perspective. They can do much toward helping the hard work of law enforcement officers at all levels of government. But in the ultimate job of driving out gangsters and racketeers from our national life, nothing can replace the force of an aroused, determined, informed, and articulate public. That means everyone in America. Shortly after 8 in the morning on June 22, 1962, at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, a convicted narcotics dealer named Joseph Valachi picked up a 2-foot length of iron pipe left over from some prison repair work. Before anyone could stop him, Valachi suddenly rushed at a fellow inmate from behind and beat him to death. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a routine prison murder. It was not. It stands as one of the most dramatic developments in the long battle between the forces of law and the forces of racketeering. Organized crime is the biggest business in this country. It grosses close to 10% of the national income, more than $40 billion a year, and virtually forms a state within the state. While it pays no taxes to the government, it pays to corrupt countless public officials at all levels. Besides its illicit rackets, it has increasingly infiltrated and taken over legitimate businesses and labor unions. Last year, the Justice Department's drive against organized crime resulted in a record 251 individual convictions, compared with only 45 in 1960. Now, in the words of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the Valachi case has provided the department with the biggest intelligence breakthrough we have ever had. For weeks, Joseph Valachi had been living in terror. Even though he was behind bars, he had learned that the underworld bad sentenced him to die because he was suspected of having cooperated with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In a frantic attempt to save himself, he assaulted the convict who he believed had been appointed his executioner. At first, Valachi refused to give prison authorities any reason for the killing. "I just went crazy," he insisted. "I was in a fog." But then, seized anew by fears for his life, he began to crack. He asked to see the narcotics agent who had questioned him initially after his arrest in 1959. At that time, the agent had managed to wheedle some fragmentary information out of Valachi about narcotics traffic across U.S. borders. Now it became quickly apparent that he had a far bigger story to tell. At this critical juncture, a special section of the Justice Department expressly created by Attorney General Kennedy to deal with organized crime and racketeering, stepped in. It had Valachi yanked out of the prison system proper and turned over to a veteran FBI agent who spent 8 months coaxing his unpredictable prisoner to talk. During his interrogation, Valachi admitted taking part in at least 4 previously unsolved gangland slayings stretching back to 1930. In addition, he supplied details about more than 30 others. From him, at long last, the Justice Department learned the real reasons behind the famous meeting of underworld chieftains in I-957 at Appalachian, New York. And for the first time, the department also got an inside account of many bloody feuds that have mysteriously corrupted in the gang world. Among them, the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate racketeer Frank Costello and the murder of mobster Albert Anastasia. But Valachi's major disclosure was the complete story of the operation of a powerful underworld society that is popularly known as the Mafia. Actually, its members don't call it the Mafia, he reported. It is big and highly organized. It runs a huge network of criminal activity from coast-to-coast murders, corrupting and nettling hundreds of millions of dollars. Its true name, in Italian Cosa Nostra. The English William translation is Our Thing. Before Valachi came along, says William Hundley, who heads the Justice Department section on organized crime, we had no tangible evidence that anything like this actually existed. He is the first to talk openly and specifically about the organization. In the past, we have heard that so-and-so was a syndicate man, and that was all. Frankly, I always thought it was a lot of hogwash. But Valachi named names. He showed us what the structure is and how it operates. He told us who the strong ones in it are. And better yet, he told us about the weak ones, those who could possibly be turned into informers. In a sense, we are like a football coach who has suddenly been given all the strengths and weaknesses of the other team. Except this isn't a game. Valachi, now 58, is squat and swarthy. He has impassive brown eyes and a shock of iron-grey hair. His voice is guttural, and his English crude. When he speaks of Cosa Nostra, he smokes cigarettes in an endless chain, and he says he can feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It is not surprising. He has been ordered to kill men for doing far less than he has done. Valachi has been in Cosa Nostra since 1930. Starting out as a gunman, he moved into the policy numbers racket under big-time mobster Vito Genovese. By the end of World War II, he was already recognized by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics as a major figure in the shipment of dope across U.S. borders. Finally seized, he was sentenced in 1960 to 15 years in prison. No one else has ever broken Cosa Nostra's rigid conspiracy of silence and lived to talk about it. Valachi has named scores of its members. He is a walking encyclopedia of its habits, its rules, its vendettas, and its main areas of activity. Today, as a result, he is the most closely guarded prisoner in federal hands. Only a handful of top officials know his whereabouts. A great deal of what he has revealed to the FBI is still secret. Cosa Nostra is divided into units, each of which is called a family. Each family reigns supreme in its own area. These areas include Boston, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Newark, New York City, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. In Valachi's words, resort centers such as Miami and Las Vegas are loose or open. This means that any family, wherever its base, can maintain members and rackets there. The ruler of a family is known as the capo or boss. Under him are a number of lieutenants. Each lieutenant is in charge of a realm or crew. The crew, in turn, is composed of soldiers. Some soldiers work directly for their lieutenants. Others are permitted to conduct their own illicit operations, often involving outsiders, who are aware only of a vague syndicate or mob lurking in the background. About a third of Cosa Nostra's members are in New York City. They are split into 5 families. Valachi named the boss of each. These 5 men are the overlords of organized crime in the nation's largest metropolis. While police have long recognized them as big-time racketeers, their exact status in the underworld has remained uncertain. All have pretended respectability in such fields as importing, real estate, and manufacturing. One of them, Vito Genovese, was asked by a Senate investigating committee if he had any moral scruples about killing a man. He replied, "I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that my answer may tend to incriminate me." So feared is Genovese that he retains his position even though he is serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for trafficking in narcotics. He is currently petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse his conviction. Meanwhile, nobody has dared displace him. As Valachi commented, they wait to see how Vito makes out. A second Cosa Nostra boss in New York City, named by Valachi, is Joseph, Joe Bananas, Bonanno. In an effort to achieve legitimate status, Bonanno has taken up residence in Tucson, Arizona, where he poses as nothing more than a successful dabbler in real estate. A third, Carlo Gambino, blandly describes himself as a labor management consultant. Still a fourth, and the oldest in terms of tenure, is Thomas, Three-Finger Brown, Lucchesi. The fifth, Joseph Profaci, has died of cancer since Valachi's defection. He ran his family in Brooklyn for more than 30 years, and the wreaths of flowers at his funeral last year were in the best gangland tradition. Profaci is believed to have been succeeded by his brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco. On a national scale, Cosa Nostra has no Mr. Big. Instead, it has been governed in recent years by a Grand Council or Commission of 12 individual bosses scattered across the country, as a result of intensive undercover intelligence work. The FBI now knows who the 12 are. All the New York bosses sit on it. The others are Joseph Zerilli from Detroit, Angelo Bruno from Philadelphia, Sam Giancana from Chicago, Stefano Magadino from Buffalo, Raymond Patriarca from Providence and Boston, John T. Scalish from Cleveland, and Sebastian Big John La Rocca from Pittsburgh. The council has one main purpose: to keep Cosa Nostra a going concern. It is the final arbiter on disputes that crop up between one family and another. When a boss dies, or is otherwise removed, it must confirm the man who succeeds him. It also decides when new talent can be brought into the fold. There have been only two such periods in modern times. Membership books were opened in 1930 for 1 year. In 1954, they were reopened, this time for 4 years. There is one inflexible requirement for admission: Italian parentage on both sides. Valachi says that he has never heard of an exception to this. Theoretically, a proposed candidate must also kill for Cosa Nostra before he is fully accepted. But, according to Valachi, this requirement was largely ignored during the last recruitment period. Then, how much dough a guy could bring in was what counted. Ironically, Valachi views such a change from the old days with scorn. For him, it is still another sign that Cosa Nostra is going soft. "They're all hungry for the buck," he says. "Nobody gives a damn about the organization." Valachi grew up in New York City, the son of an immigrant day laborer. With a grammar school education and 4 years in Sing Sing behind him, his initiation into Cosa Nostra in 1930 took place in the back room of a restaurant. Religious pictures had been put up on the wall for the ceremony. On the table lay a revolver and a knife. First, his finger was pricked and blood drawn. Then, as he repeated the oath of allegiance, he had to hold a piece of burning paper in his cupped hands. He pledged total submission to the leaders of the organization. He also had to swear never to touch the wife of another Cosa Nostra member. But above all else, there was the most important oath: if I talk, I'm dead. In Cosa Nostra jargon, a member is made when he has been finally admitted. A greaseball is an old line member born outside the United States. Murder is a hit. The assignment to carry out a hit is called a contract. A member who receives a contract gets no money to carry it out. It is an obligation under his oath of allegiance. When one member has to meet another for the first time, a third member known to both must officiate. The recognition signal is, "He is a friend of ours." The key word is ours. If the introduction is "he is a friend of mine," it means nothing more than that. Anyone who goes wrong or informs is automatically sentenced to death. "When a guy talks," says Valachi, "it's a family affair, and the family must take care of it." As a soldier in the family of Vito Genovese, Valachi was often tapped for such executions. One case involved Eugene Giannini, a suspected tipster to narcotics agents. Enlisting the aid of 3 Confederates, Valachi had Giannini tailed for a week. From this, he learned that his prey regularly showed up at a crap game in East Harlem. An inspection of the area revealed a nearby alley that offered easy access to an adjoining street where a getaway car could be stationed. Valachi invited Giannini to join him for a round of drinks, and the 2 men spent a convivial evening together. At the end of it, Valachi introduced Giannini to a girl and left. A few nights later, he sent word into the crap game that he wanted to see Giannini. At first, Giannini poked his head cautiously outside the door, but when he saw Valachi apparently alone, he stepped boldly into the street. Valachi asked him how he liked the girl. Giannini never had a chance to reply. New York police records note that Giannini's body was found on an East Harlem street at 6:20 in the morning on September 20th, 1952. Unknown persons, said the report, had fired 2 bullets into the back of his head. For the average newspaper reader, if he noticed it at all, Giannini's murder hardly was worth what little space it got. But for Cosa Nostra, it was a basic method of protecting its vast income from narcotics, gambling, and various shakedown rackets. Another of its thriving operations, although less publicized, is money lending or shylocking. Cosa Nostra's coffers are full of money to lend at weekly interest rates of 20%. This means that a loan of, say, $10,000, if it rides for just 1 year, requires repayment of $114,000. But to an entrepreneur strapped for cash and unable to borrow through normal channels, the temptation can be irresistible. The result often is that he finds himself with a new set of partners. Sometimes they are content to have acquired a legitimate front. Other times, their greed gets the best of them. 3 hoodlums named by Valachi as members of Cosa Nostra were indicted recently in what the Justice Department calls the most audacious bankruptcy fraud ever to come to federal court in New York City. As security for an $8,000 loan, the indictment charges, they took over a meatpacking firm and milked it of some $745,000 within a week. Today, for all its muscle, Cosa Nostra is nonetheless having its troubles. One of its most lucrative rackets has been the illegal importation of narcotics. The investment required was relatively small, the turnover was quick, and the profits enormous. A pound of heroin purchased in Marseille, France, for about $5,000 can be cut up and retailed in the United States for an average of $32,000. But now, according to Valachi, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics has cracked down so hard that Cosa Nostra's Grand Council no longer sanctions traffic in dope. This has led to an even more serious problem: a breakdown in Cosa Nostra's discipline. Despite the Grand Council's edict, individual members still persist in handling narcotics secretly. Valachi blames it on the greed of the bosses. In the old days, as he calls them, each family divided its total take among all its members. Today, only the Chicago family follows this procedure. Elsewhere, there is no pooling of profits. The result has been an ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Vito Genovese, for instance, has amassed a personal fortune estimated at more than $30 million. Joseph Zerilli, Cosa Nostra boss in Detroit, can live luxuriously in the fashionable suburb of Grosse Pointe. On the other hand, many Cosa Nostra rank-and-file soldiers, lacking a bankroll for currently favored rackets like gambling and money lending, have been reduced to working on the docks and construction jobs. So they return constantly to narcotics as a way to make a buck. The tendency of Cosa Nostra chieftains to grab everything for themselves pervades the organization today, Valachi says. He cites the case of one Stephen, Buck Jones, Casertano, a soldier in the family of Vito Genovese, who ran a modest money-lending operation. After Casertano got cancer, Genovese generously assigned a man to collect his outstanding loans, amounting to about $20,000, with the explanation that he would turn the money over to Casertano's widow. When Casertano died, however, Genovese kept it all. To stop the grumbling from their soldiers, a number of bosses have eliminated the family head tax they traditionally imposed. This tax, usually ranging from $25 to $50 a month, was theoretically reserved for such expenses as hiring defense lawyers for a soldier who had been arrested and supporting his wife and children if he ended up in prison. In fact, a boss could do whatever he wanted with the money and often did. This is what started open warfare in one Cosa Nostra family, according to Valachi. The late Joseph Profaci decided in 1958 to hike his taxes, and he soon had a rebellion on his hands led by the notorious Gallo brothers. Today, even after his death, scarcely a week passes without New York newspapers headlining new bloodshed between the Gallo gang and the Profaci loyalists. The jealousy and intrigue within Cosa Nostra extend to its highest overlords. Nothing in recent years caused a bigger uproar within the organization than the attempt to murder Frank Costello one night in 1957 as he entered the lobby of his Manhattan apartment house. From Valachi, for the first time, the Justice Department got a complete account of the fight. A few historical notes are necessary. In the mid-30s, Vito Genovese, already a Cosa Nostra power, had to flee the country to escape a murder charge. Costello, who had been a Genovese lieutenant, took his place as family boss. As World War II drew to a close, Genovese was located in Italy. Genovese, who had received honors from Mussolini for his financial contributions to the fascist movement, was working as an interpreter for the American military government while simultaneously running a huge black market ring. He was brought back to the United States to stand trial. Just as his case was going to court, the principal witness against him was found dead in a jail cell where he was being kept in protective custody. He had been poisoned. Once freed, Genovese regained control of his family, but Costello still remained czar of a huge gambling empire that he had carved out, independent of the Genovese family. As such, he had a voice in Cosa Nostra policy that Genovese wanted for himself. Genovese's solution was to plot Costello's death. According to Valachi, Genovese picked a gunman named Vincente, the Chin Gigante, to pull the trigger. In his haste, however, Gigante aimed badly. The bullet only creased Costello's skull. As Valachi wryly notes, the Chin wasted a whole month practicing. Even so, the shooting effectively removed Costello as a rival. Since that time, he has been in and out of court and is currently fighting a deportation order. For another Cosa Nostra chieftain, the struggle was more decisive. He was the infamous Albert Anastasia, known even among his own henchmen as a Madhatta who killed left and right for nothing. Anastasia, along-time Costello Ali, promptly began broadcasting threats of revenge. An angry Anastasia was enough to make even Genovese nervous. He contacted an ambitious Anastasia lieutenant, Carlo Gambino, and convinced him they would both benefit from Anastasia's death. A few days later, Anastasia was getting a haircut in the barbershop of a New York hotel, when the killers picked to do the job walked in, drew pistols, and cut him to pieces in a storm of bullets. With his flanks neatly covered, Genovese could benevolently watch Gambino inherit Anastasia's mantle as a Cosa Nostra boss. In talking about Anastasia, Valachi, an angry Anastasia was enough to make even Genovese nervous. He contacted an ambitious Anastasia lieutenant, Carlo Gambino, and convinced him they would both benefit from Anastasia's death. A few days later, Anastasia was getting a haircut in the barbershop of a New York hotel, when the killers picked to do the job walked in, drew pistols, and cut him to pieces in a storm of bullets. With his flanks neatly covered, Genovese could benevolently watch Gambino inherit Anastasia's mantle as a Cosa Nostra boss. In talking about Anastasia, Valachi also gave the FBI an explanation for some less significant but equally celebrated crimes, including one that had baffled police for 10 years. One night in 1953, a young man named Arnold Schuster was on his way home in Brooklyn when he suddenly spotted a familiar face that he had seen on a wanted poster. It was Willie Sutton, the legendary bank robber, and the object of a nationwide manhunt. Schuster told the police, and Sutton was arrested. Schuster experienced a brief moment in the limelight, then was shot down. According to Valachi, Anastasia was watching a television interview of young Schuster when he suddenly exploded with rage. "I can't stand squealers," he told one of his gunmen. "Hit this guy." To cover himself, Anastasia then had Schuster's killer, one Frederick Tenuto, murdered in turn. At that time, this tiny New York town was suggested by Stefano Magaddino, identified by Valachi as the Cosa Nostra boss in Buffalo. A Magaddino lieutenant named Joseph Barbara had a home there, and Magaddino argued that it was a perfect place to escape police surveillance. In fact, just the opposite happened. An alert New York state trooper noticed the sudden appearance of many important underworld figures and raided the meeting just as it began. In a series of smaller gatherings, held later throughout the country, Carlo Gambino eventually won confirmation as Anastasia's successor. Genovese, for his part, argued that Costello had actually been out to get him. But he was just going through the motions of offering a defense. He had become so powerful that nobody was willing to dispute him. In April 1959, Genovese was finally convicted on narcotics charges and sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The next year, Valachi himself wound up in Atlanta on a similar conviction and became a cellmate of his old boss. Valachi's life was uneventful until May 1962, when he first heard that he had been marked for death as an informer. Though Valachi had once supplied narcotics agents with a few tidbits about a particular case, he had never mentioned even the existence of Cosa Nostra. A few days later, Genovese turned to him and said, "Once an apple gets touched and goes bad, it's got to be taken out." With that, Valachi says, Genovese embraced him with the kiss of death, a farewell kiss on both cheeks. In a frenzy of fear, Valachi requested solitary confinement. When a month passed without his giving prison authorities any reason for his request, he was returned to normal prison life. The morning of his release, he spotted a newly arrived convict who he thought was his executioner. That was when he attacked. Valachi's revelations have already started more than a dozen FBI investigations that are rapidly bearing fruit. He himself will testify publicly, although the time and place have yet to be decided. Moreover, the FBI has also cultivated a number of other informants within the organization, and with concrete proof of the existence of a national crime syndicate. The Justice Department will soon press for new legislation to fill the gaps in existing laws. Meanwhile, ever since Valachi was whisked out of Atlanta a year ago, rumors have buzzed among Cosa Nostra bosses to which he had talked. Now they know the truth. Joseph Valachi, feeling betrayed by the order for his execution, has turned against his executioners. "I'm going to destroy them," he says. The end. Robert F. Kennedy had finally uncovered a sinister web spun deep within the shadows of power. He had been delving into the murky world of notorious criminals for years, his understanding of the lethal machinations of Murder Incorporated sharpening with each passing moment. It was a realm where whispers of treachery were as common as the cold silence of the grave. Among the tales of betrayal, one name stood out: Abe Reles, the infamous snitch hurled from a window by the very guardians assigned to protect him. Such gruesome tales were merely the tip of the iceberg. Joe Valachi, with his explosive revelations, had now confirmed Kennedy's darkest suspicions. These fiends had not only orchestrated a reign of terror, massacring thousands to shroud their misdeeds in darkness, but their tendrils had also insidiously wrapped around the very core of American democracy. According to Valachi, These merciless puppet masters had been rigging national elections with a chilling efficiency that stretched back to the days of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their unholy alliance with shadowy figures within the Central Intelligence Agency began in the 50s, and by the 40s they had ensnared J. Edgar Hoover, the formidable head of the FBI. Their corruption was a cancer that had metastasized through Hollywood, where the glittering stars Kennedy once mingled with in California and Las Vegas were nothing more than marionettes dancing on the strings of organized crime. These men, whom Kennedy had labeled as notorious, dangerous, and sadistically cruel, were deeply entwined with individuals close to his own circle of power. Shocked to his core by these revelations, Kennedy urged his brother in early 1962 to sever all ties with organized crime, a directive that Jack Kennedy began to implement with urgency. As the Kennedy administration began to cleanse itself of this malignant influence, organized crime realized that their days of unchecked power were dwindling. The possibility of Kennedy securing another term spelled impending doom. The underworld had long been accustomed to public humiliation through newspapers and magazines, but the burgeoning medium of television presented a terrifying new arena. The vivid, living images broadcast into homes across America promised to unveil their dark deeds in unprecedented detail, threatening to obliterate the empire they had built on blood and secrecy. In a desperate bid to save their crumbling dynasty, they knew they had to act swiftly and decisively. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking on their reign of terror. By the 60s, the face of the Mafia had undergone a radical transformation, a stark departure from the entity that dominated the criminal underworld in the 30s. In those earlier days, figures like Lucky Luciano made calculated decisions to spare lives, such as Tom Dewey's, a testament to their strategic influence. However, the landscape of organized crime had since evolved dramatically. The Mafia was no longer merely a coalition of Italian, Jewish, or Irish factions. It had expanded into a global syndicate, enveloping a diverse array of powerful criminal organizations under its dominion. They now commanded the French Corsican Mafia, the Cuban Mafia, and a multitude of other groups, morphing into a veritable banking cartel that orchestrated the financial underpinnings of global organized crime. These syndicates were no mere players in the underworld. They had become heavyweight contenders in the narcotics trade, facilitating extensive networks that spanned continents. Their reach and influence were so extensive that they secured clandestine protection and collaboration from the Central Intelligence Agency. This protection wasn't for trivial matters. The Corsican Mafia, among others, was instrumental in CIA operations that ranged from overthrowing governments to embroiling in international scandals, a tangled web that would only come to light following the tragic demise of the Kennedys. Unbeknownst to the Kennedy brothers, their efforts to dismantle and disassociate from these malignant forces had inadvertently laid bare the workings of one of the most formidable and pervasive crime syndicates the world had ever seen. Their campaign against organized crime, driven by a quest for justice and transparency, had exposed them to the full wrath of an empire whose influence was woven deeply into the very fabric of global power structures. The Kennedys had dared to challenge an adversary whose reach and ruthlessness were beyond their wildest imaginations, setting the stage for a historic showdown that would echo through the annals of crime and politics.